Welcome back to Noir Alley. I'm your host, Eddie Muller. My definition of a truly noir story is one in which the protagonist knows what he or she is doing is wrong, but they do it anyway. This theory tends to give short shrift to cop movies, except those where John Law is either crooked or crazy. Films like Where the Sidewalk Ends, The Prowler, and Shield for Murder, for example. Most cop films don't have the requisite amount of moral ambiguity to be noir. So today's film, Between Midnight and Dawn, made at Columbia in 1950, isn't really emblematic of the genre, but it is a fascinating film with more going on under the surface than meets the eye. What meets the eye is pretty compelling, thanks to the fantastic cinematography of George Discant, who's the real star of the show here. Most of Discant's best work in the genre was done at RKO, including They Live by Night, The Narrow Margin, and On Dangerous Ground, all classics of the form. Between Midnight and Dawn was one of the first movies to feature uniformed police officers as main characters. Now, considering how cops would come to dominate American television, it's astounding to realize that in films from the mid-20th century, patrolmen and beat cops were rarely principal characters. There were detectives and inspectors aplenty, but the boys in blue were relegated to the margins, only brought center stage to handcuff the villain in the film's final minute. Between Midnight and Dawn is perhaps the first example of the now common buddy cop movie. Edmund O'Brien and Mark Stevens star as Dan Purvis and Rocky Barnes, lifelong pals who survived World War II and are continuing their armed service on the peacetime streets of Los Angeles. It's clear from the film's production files that writers Gerald Drayson Adams and Leo Katcher intended an unflinching look at street-level big city crime. Their treatment included a child molester, dope peddlers, and the shocking massacre of 4 uniformed police officers. Tough stuff for the time. Too tough for the production code, which insisted that all that be removed and that any suggestion of gangsterism be downplayed. That also meant changing the ethnicity of the villain, played by Donald Bucca. Riccardo Gennaro became Richie Garris, so as not to be suggestive of Italian extraction. Eugene Ling's adapted screenplay bumped up the humor and romance and sanded down the grittiness of what was intended as an LA version of 1948's groundbreaking New York policier, Naked City. The opening narration even emulates Mark Hellinger's casual voiceover from that film, which in 1950 was a welcome respite from the stiff and righteous voiceovers typical of Law and Order pictures. While Edmund O'Brien and Mark Stevens were fixtures in noir, few actresses were less suited to the genre than Gail Storm, who made this film 2 years before she became America's TV sweetheart on the popular series My Little Margie. On the rare occasions that Storm skirted through the dark side, it was as a perky and winsome foil to hard-boiled stalwarts like Dennis O'Keefe in the underrated 1949 film Abandoned, and Dan Duryea in The Underworld Story, released the same year as Between Midnight and Dawn. Storm didn't make many noirs, but the 3 she's in are all crackerjack. Between Midnight and Dawn veers between jocular humor and surprisingly violent drama. Director Gordon Douglas was familiar with both, having spent many years at Hal Roach's studio directing Our Gang comedies before moving to the B Unit at RKO, where he helmed a number of entries in the Dick Tracy and Falcon series before graduating to A features in the late 40s, mostly for Columbia. Due to budget constraints that limited on-location shooting, he couldn't quite muster the gritty realism he wanted for this film. Instead, he leaned heavily on George Discant's ability to integrate on-location footage with scenes clearly shot on a studio backlot. Originally titled Prowl Car, until the title was changed a month prior to its release on October 1st, 1950, here is Between Midnight and Dawn.